Welcome everybody to another episode of In the Reading Corner. And it's a special episode today because we are interviewing all 5 shortlisted poets for the Clipper Poetry Award. Today's the turn of Brian Bilston, who's a poet and novelist, and he's been published for adults and for children. He's amassed quite a following through social media, earning the sobriquet the Poet Laureate of Twitter. His witty, wry voice has a very wide appeal, and his most recent collection of poems for children, Let Sleeping Cats Lie, is shortlisted for the Clipper Poetry Awards. I'm very pleased to welcome Brian to my reading corner.
Hi, Nikki. Thanks for inviting me.
One of the first things that I wanted to explore was when poetry came into your life, whether it was something that was there from childhood, whether somebody read poetry to you or whether you volitionally picked up poetry to read it. But if not, when did poetry become a thing for you?
Yes, that's a good question. I don't think there was any one moment as such. And I do remember reading poetry and having poetry read to me as a child. It wasn't really part of my life back then. I remember having good fun in the classroom, poetry writing assignments and writing poetry in the shape of different things, which I do even now. But it wasn't really until I was mid to late teenage years that I really encountered poetry. Up until that point, my main reading had been stories, novels, although I'd always been fascinated with words. And I think I kind of grew up in a house where we didn't really have that many books, but what we did have was a love of music. And in particular, as a young lad, one of the things that really grabbed me about the music that was on in the house at the time was listening to the lyrics. And I suppose now, when I look back at it, I've always been quite obsessed with that sort of short form, being able to instill words in a concise, interesting way. And listening to the lyrics of Eleanor Rigby, for instance, I remember just kind of marvelling at that, or just wondering what on earth the Beatles were singing about when they were singing about that walrus. So I've always had that love, but it wasn't really until I was a bit older that I really got into poetry as such. And I think that's when I found poets who could really make me laugh or make me smile. I encountered John Hegley when I was about 15 or 16. I saw him on the television, I think, first. I thought he was a comedian, and then I realised actually he was a poet too. And I went out and bought one of his books. I was instantly hooked. And then all of a sudden you realise actually there are other people out there who are doing similar or complementary things. And that opened up that kind of door for me.
It's really interesting. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things from what you've said. The first one is the calligrams, the shape poems, which of course still do feature in your collections. And I think one of the things that you do with your calligrams is that it always reflects the meaning of the poem. Whereas sometimes when we do our shape poems in school, it's here's a template of an animal and just write what you want about an elephant around the outside. They're, in a way, difficult poems to write, I think, a little bit like acrostics. They're the ones that get done in school, but to really make them into poetry isn't that easy, is it?
No, and it's funny when I started doing those, I think it probably kind of stemmed out of sharing poetry on social media and the realisation that I was sending poems around in this sort of world which was dominated by photographs and film. And sometimes words on a page could be quite easily missed in that context. So I did start to think quite hard about how I present my poems in that way. But like you say, I don't just do it for the sake of it. I feel it has to really link in with the theme in some way and add something to the words, not just simply be a mirror for the words.
I'm also interested to hear about the teenage years being important for poetry. I did have a childhood that was infused with poetry, mainly because my dad loved it so much. So he would always buy me a poetry book in the school holidays. But in the teenage years, it was anything that was tragic. So you talked a lot about the humour there, but for me, it was anything that was tragic. And I think the thing that connects that is the intensity of emotional experience in that very important coming into adulthood.
Although I summed it up as the poetry that appealed to me was humour. To be honest, though, before I encountered John Hegley, the first poet that I'd studied at school, at secondary school, that I really liked was Philip Larkin. I ended up doing for A-level. And actually what appealed to me about some of his poems was that there was this sort of very black sense of humour but also he was writing about quite miserable things. And I found those kind of teenage years, they were quite difficult years for me in many ways. And so humor was an escape, but also I liked hearing about the misery of others back then too. So somebody who combined both those things did really appeal. And also there were a few swear words in there too, which was always quite helpful when you're at a certain age.
You can't forget that line about your mum and dad, can you?
You really can't, no.
That's a little bit about your reading of poetry. My next question really is about writing. Why do you write poetry? What's in it for you?
Yes, what is in it for me? Why that's a pretty existential question, really. I started writing poetry really when I was in my early 30s, but not sharing it with anyone. It was purely for my own consumption and enjoyment and the process of writing. I think the spark there was just simply having fun with language and seeing what you could do with words. I think a lot of them were probably quite silly poems involving puns and idioms and all sorts of things. I still do love all of that. So I think that's what got me writing poetry in the first place, is that kind of joy of words. But then I think there's something about the experience of that actual kind of act of writing poetry that I really like. It takes me to a slightly different place to where I spend most of my time. It really uses my brain. So actually, outside of poetry, I do a lot of things like crosswords and other kind of puzzles, and I really do like focusing in on something. And poetry's like that, trying to find the right word or the right way of saying something. So there's something about the act of doing it is very helpful. And I think also over time, the more I've done it, then the more I think the different types of poetry I've ended up writing, and to a certain degree, I use poetry as a form of self-therapy as well, particularly at a time when, the world can be quite problematic. I use it as a way of writing about how I feel about a particular subject area, or a way of making sense of it in some way, not necessarily trying to answer the world's problems, but just to get down on paper what's going on in my head in relation to it. And I find that helpful.
It's interesting, we're talking about writing poetry here, but I wondered whether that is how composing happens. Do you sit down at a desk to write, or are you actually composing in your head and then suddenly you have to get it down on paper? How does that alchemy all work?
Oh, I wish I knew. To be honest, it is both those things. Because I came to poetry as a career quite late, very late, really. For a long time, I had a job working in an office. I don't do that anymore, but I think one thing it has instilled in me is this idea of routine. I do a 9 to 5 job of being a poet, even though that 9 to 5 job might not be me just sat at my desk for all those hours, although I am sat at my desk for quite a few hours. It's a real mix of creating that time and that space in which to write, but also not getting so wedded to it that it then becomes an obstacle. So I'm forever getting up, and I might go on a bike ride or a walk. If I've got an idea for a poem, sometimes it comes very quickly and naturally, and I can get it down almost in a few minutes, probably because it's been knocking around in my head for a while and it's a fairly simple conceit. But other times I'll be walking around, moving around town with that in my brain, just doing its sort of thing in the background there while I eat another Danish pastry.
I get that. And I wonder whether poems that you've written in the past are still there. Do they just pop into your head from time to time and you've got your poem in your head and you're listening to yourself reread it, as it were?
Yes, sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that used to happen a lot more to me than it does now in some ways. And I think it's probably, again, because of the nature of the poetry that I've written has probably changed over those years. You mentioned, how I used to be known as a sort of poet laureate of Twitter, and most of my poems that I was writing were really written for Twitter and written in a kind of short format. And so there was something about that enabled me, as I was walking to work or when I was sat there in my lunch hour, to think of the words in my brain and almost form the poem in entirety in my brain. And then sometimes you then put it down on paper and think, oh, that's not quite right. I need to play around with it a little bit. But I think now, though, I don't really do that sort of thing quite so much. And so what's more likely to happen is that I hear a word or a phrase, or I have a thought or an idea about a poem, and it's a longer process for me now. I don't quite know whether that's going to be a poem that's going to be 280 characters like it used to be on Twitter, or it's going to be a whole page or a couple of pages. Not really until I sit down at my desk and start just prodding it and exploring it a bit more.
One of the questions that I thought I would ask you was about how important performance is to you, but actually Twitter is a kind of performance.
I suppose so. And actually, people on Twitter themselves are very performative, it must be said. When I joined Twitter, I joined under the pseudonym of Brian, and the whole Brian Bilston persona is a kind of performance in itself in some ways, although it's very similar to the real me. And one of the things I would do on social media is be very interactive with people who commented on my poems too. And so the persona would carry on into that too, in terms of how, not just the words I was writing for my poem, but performance has become an increasingly important part of what I do. I mean, for years, I was just sharing poems on social media, but now I'm out and about. I have to pluck up the courage to go on stage in theatres and art centres and read my poems. And that's something I thought I'd never be able to do because I'm quite shy. I've spent a whole lifetime trying to avoid being on a stage and bearing my soul to 400 people. So it's a real puzzle to me that that's now what I do, partly for a living. But I do enjoy it all the same. I think I've learned various techniques which have kind of helped me overcome my fears, not least to think I am the best person who could be delivering this poem. Whether people like it or not, this is what I've got and I know how best to do it. So I have come to grips with it all and I do really enjoy it, particularly while I'm on stage and afterwards. What I still struggle with is just the thought of going on stage.
Let's talk about the collection that's been shortlisted for the Clipper, Let Sleeping Cats Lie. The theme is pets. Introduce the collection to us in your words. Were those poems knocking around and you decided to make them into a collection, or did you write it as a collection?
Again, a little bit of both. I did write it as a collection. There were a handful of poems that I'd written already. Over the years, I've written a lot of poems about my cat, usually not necessarily with children in mind, just to share on social media. I've always kind of loved animals. My previous collection for children was a football themed book. I really enjoyed the experience of writing those football poems. So I'm a big football fan. Having enjoyed that experience so much, I was casting my mind around as to what other things I really love. The subject of animals came up very quickly. And so I had these sort of starting point with a handful of poems. And then one thing I find quite helpful once I've got an idea for a book or a collection is I basically brainstorm a whole list of ideas. And having thought I'll focus this on pets, then the obvious thing then is to think about what range are we talking about within that? What pets are there? Once you get beyond cats and dogs, then also I made a list of gerbils and hamsters and snakes and spiders and all, and then various weird and wonderful ones. I mean, maybe a dinosaur could be a pet too. And I thought about different approaches because although I primarily write poetry that's supposed to be fun and make you laugh, I didn't want it just to be that either. So I thought about the issues that we all have when we have pets. We love them very much, but there comes a time when we have to say goodbye to them, for instance. Not everyone has a pet. Some kids would really love one. What's that to not have a pet to come back to? So I started thinking about those issues too. Yeah, I just took it from there. So I had a hit list of poems I wanted to write. I didn't end up writing all of them because sometimes you have the idea you think is great, can't quite find the words. That's how it happened.
I did ask if you choose a poem to read to us. What have you chosen?
Yes, I've chosen a poem called What's in a Name? And in some ways this is perhaps not typical. This is a more kind of thoughtful and reflective poem. But I think it's the poem that in some ways means the most to me in this collection because it is very directly about my beloved cat who accompanied me for the writing of some of these poems, but previous collection is nearly everything I've ever done. She's no longer with us anymore, but I did want to write a poem in her memory. Okay, What's in a Name? The name had found her before we did. She was called Buttons, the man at the animal centre told us when we met her for the first time. You can change it if you like, he said. But we didn't. Buttons it would be, we agreed, when we went back to get her. She'd be used to it, we told ourselves. She had enough to contend with already. Besides, she looked like a Buttons. But over the years, her name did change. Butsy should be most often. Also, Buttles, Butsy Burger, Butsy Malone. After gifting us a live mouse, Butthead, we'd scream, or sometimes just, you silly cat. Those occasions we'd transport her on a cushion from one sofa to the other. a journey for which she'd reserve her most regal and imperious manner. It was only fitting that she be the Empress of Batonia. But that last time, when we went to the vet's to collect her, to bring her back home again, not this time in a strong and sturdy cat carrier, but in a small, heart-shaped silver urn, she was Buttons once more. Our Buttons.
There's a whole range of tones and emotions in a collection like this, that being one of the more reflective. And it leads me to thinking about the voice in which these poems are written. That's obviously a very personal voice. And some of the poems are written as though a child might be writing them, and some of them are not. Do you see yourself as writing these poems for children?
That's a very good question. In some ways, I'm not quite sure. Sometimes I'm not very self-analytic, so I don't quite know what I'm doing. And I think if anything, I'm writing, it sounds quite selfish, but I'm writing these poems for myself. It just so happens, sometimes because of the topic, that these will be appropriate for children. I don't see like a huge amount of difference in my thought processes when writing for children versus grown-ups. And in fact, there's often quite a lot of crossover, I find. And my very first collection that came out, which were mainly poems that posted on Twitter, I used to have a lot of people saying their 9-year-old son really loves them. They love the wordplay. And I kind of think, I don't think you should be showing that book to your 9-year-olds, because actually there's some inappropriate poems in there too. But of course, I didn't really make those distinctions when I was writing those poems in the first place. I think one thing I would say is that it's easier to take all the shackles off when you're writing for children. I think there's less expectation that a poem needs to be a certain kind of thing when writing for children, because basically children are far more imaginative and accepting and carry so much more joy in them than a lot of grown-ups. And so I feel like it's probably easier from that perspective. I don't have to think about what snooty critics might say about adult poetry. They don't seem to exist in the same way in children's poetry.
The other side of that is because you don't have a clear image of who the reader of this is. It means that there are layers of different kinds of poems in there, some of which will be harder for a younger reader to access. But the joy of it is that they are there for them. And a poetry collection is something that you come back to. Certainly the collections that my dad gave me when I was a child, I go back to them now and I see very different things in those poems. And they sit alongside each other in a way that you don't get in a novel. It's quite different in a poetry collection, I think.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I'm a great believer in that you don't always have to understand everything to enjoy it. Thinking back to music and hearing some of those lyrics of the songs that were being played in my own childhood, I didn't know what half of them meant, but in some ways I didn't really care, because I liked the sound of them, I liked the musicality of the language. They were intriguing. Sometimes it might make me laugh, but I didn't really know why it was funny. And then you go back to it, like you say, when you're a bit older and you maybe have different perspectives on it.
I chose one for you to read as well for a number of reasons. You talked about idiom being something that you love, and this poem has lots of idioms in it. It's the Meditations of Colin, the lugubrious goldfish. And just to give you a little bit of an anecdote, I've just been speaking to Colette Hillier, whose collection is also shortlisted for the Clipper, the Colossal Book of Words for Kids. And one of the words that I looked for in there was lugubrious. And if you would read it to us, I'd be delighted.
Of course. Meditations of Colin, the lugubrious goldfish. 1. I would rather be a big fish in a little pond than a little pond in a big fish. 2. When you say, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime, I say, why are you encouraging this man to eat so many fish? Some of them might be my friends. 3. Ask yourself not how large is the tank, but how pretty is the ornamental treasure chest. 4. Tomorrow is another day, although chances are it will be a lot like this one. 5. It is never too late to start over again. except perhaps for Frank, who's been floating at the top of the tank for about half an hour now. 6. Believe in yourself and you can do anything. Unless you're a goldfish, in which case professional golfer may be beyond you. 7. What goes around comes around. Oh look, here's that sunken pirate ship feature again. 8. It's not the taking part, it's the swimming that counts. 9. People need pets like a fish needs a bicycle. And I really need a bicycle. 10. We are all in the fish tank, but some of us are looking at the starfish.
I just couldn't help chuckling all the way through that. But of course, it is contingent to some extent on you knowing the language and how it's used, the idioms. In a way, that's also one of the reasons that I asked you to read that one, because some children will be laughing at that. They won't even know why they're laughing at it, because there's something very basic and funny about it. But an adult like me is probably laughing for a different reason.
That's right. And in film, for instance, these days too, I think about all those amazing Pixar films. I think they were one of the first ones to do this, which are aimed at children, but there's plenty of things in there for the adults that will be watching the films too.
And I have to say, you're not above silliness either, so we've got some silliness in there too.
I do really enjoy silliness. It must be said. Perhaps I enjoy it too much for a person of my age. It does help to keep me young.
I feel that I could talk to you all day. There's so much more that I'd like to explore. But one final question. On your poetry reading pile, what's risen to the top of the list right now?
I always have a very large pile of books. With poetry, I do love collections by individual authors, but what often really gets me is an anthology and a moving from one different voice to another. So I'm reading actually this anthology called Cozy Poems, which is just perfect in these days of turmoil out there. So there are kind of poems in here about the changing nature of the seasons, about how nice it is to be hugged, about the joy of a hot chocolate, all sorts of different things. And one of the things I really love about it, though, there's a real mix of voices and writers from across the ages. There's a poem in here by Nikki Gill, but then there's one by Edward Thomas. And so I just love that when you turn a page, you never quite know what's coming next. It can take you to a completely different space.
And I guess one of the things that you're saying there is how poetry can be a real mood changer, and we can choose the poems that we need for that time to calm us down, to energize us, to make us feel safe, to unsettle us. We can do all of those things.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's important for all of us. I think that's important for children. Children can discover that about poetry more than anything else when they're at that kind of young age. That's going to be the thing that would get them to stick with it. The fact that there's a poem out there for every child, for every situation. Sometimes it's not easy to find that poem, but it will be knocking around out there somewhere.
You see, I think there's one there, even for Colin the goldfish. Brian, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, and congratulations on making it to the shortlist of the very important Clipper Prize. I really look forward to seeing how the shadowing groups of children respond to the poems and what they do with them. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Nikki. It's been a pleasure.